Abraham left Mamre, which is just out of Hebron, to the land of Gerar. He had already planned out with Sarah to claim her as his sister, to protect him from being killed so that they would take her, because she was beautiful, which they had done before in Egypt, but this time they ended up with the same result. You see how I did that? It was trying to make it seem like, but this time, no, it was the same result. King Abimelech took Sarah into his harem to be his because of this deceit. But God intervened. He came to Abimelech in a dream and told him, hey, you're a dead man for taking Sarah as his own. Abimelech then told God that they told him both that they were brother and sister. They both told me that. And his conscience was clean before the Lord. And obviously I'm summarizing this in the shortest sense. But the Lord told him, that is why I never let you, King Abimelech, touch her or get near her. I'm protecting you. I understand your position in this. He then told the pagan king to restore Sarah to Abraham, and Abraham, who was his prophet, would pray over him, and they shall live. But if not, the king will die along with all of his household. So Abimelech called his servants, told them what had happened, and sent for Abraham and confronted him in public of what he did. Abraham stood before this pagan king in the wrong and with a completely blown witness to God. But the king restored Sarah to him, gave him sheep, oxen, male and female servants to him, and offered him land as well. This is like, you may dwell here. To make restitution with Abraham, but not just Abraham, but with his God. He also told Sarah he gave Abraham 1,000 silver pieces just to kind of vindicate her, but he referred to Abraham as her brother, so that was kind of a little salt, So Abraham prays over them, and God healed Abimelech and his wife, and their female servants and his wife's womb were back to being open. Because of Sarah, they were closed. Is this on? Yes. Okay. So now we pick things up in Genesis chapter 21, and we're in verse 1. And the Lord visited Sarah as he said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. The Lord told Sarah that this time next year, if you remember, he would visit her, for she would have a child, and he gave him the name Isaac. And the Lord gave her a son just like he said he would. But how long ago did the Lord make this promise to them? It was 25 years ago. That's a long time to wait. Would you guys like to be waiting for God's promise that long? It's a long time. We're the type of people that's ready to go, within 24 hours, right? But when we look at this and we see how long it's taken, for this promise to come in, I just want to you guys might be waiting for something in your life right now. And as you can see, just as we start right off the bat, that God fulfills his promises. It is just a matter of his timing of it all, period. So God fulfilled his promise to Sarah, and he will fulfill it in your life as well. Verse 2, for Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac, which, if you remember, it meant laughter. That was the name that God gave to him. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Now, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Woo! I hope at 100 years old he's ready to run after a toddler or give him piggyback rides and all that. But 100 years old having a child. He outdid Mick Jagger by 16 years. Mick had a son at 73 years old in 5 months. But Isaac was the son of God's promise that he gave to Abraham at the age of 100. And that's kind of like a miracle in itself, just to be like, my goodness. God also knew Abraham would live to be 160 years old, so he had a little grace in the midst of it, even at the age of 100. So God would continue the seed through Isaac, verse 6. And Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. which again, there's another reflection of Isaac's name. But she also says, all who hear will laugh with me. In other words, as in all will rejoice with her. She also said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne him a son in his old age. Notice that. She pointed out here that Abraham has a child in his old age. I think it's hilarious. Never did she once mention her old age or the fact, it's just funny. And I was always raised never to ask a woman her age, and here she's pointed out Abraham's. Look at his old age. So verse 8, so the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on that same day that Isaac was weaned. So typically in this time, the woman would nurse the child until the age of 2 to 3 years old, longer than normally that's done today. And when the child was weaned, there would be this great feast of celebration. This was a great occasion, like the child is now growing into in its youth. So Abraham, he makes this big old feast, and look what happens, verse 9. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. So she sees Ishmael, the son of Abraham, through Hagar, her maidservant, watching this big feast that is being thrown for Isaac, and Ishmael sees all of this and he responds by scoffing, meaning he was making fun of it, he was ridiculing it, he was laughing and mocking it all as if it was all just a big joke. And Sarah was watching. It happened right in front of her, and it ruins it for her. What is traditionally a celebration for Isaac, think about it. This is her first time to celebrate her child. This is the first little marking that she gets to experience with her own child. She's probably seen it many times in other people's, but this is her first time to experience this motherhood. And here, this teenage kid, Ishmael, spoils the celebration for Sarah by mocking Isaac. God takes this scoffing pretty serious, and he's very protective of his people, especially when they're in this kind of a circumstance where they're rejoicing in him, as we see in this scenario. Ishmael, who was conceived from the flesh, responds in the flesh. And scoffing or mocking of others, it does damage to people, especially to younger people. I remember a friend of mine who was a youth pastor. He shared with me of when he dealt with a certain group of kids who would be disrupted to the Bible study. This young group just kind of came in. They're checking out the Bible study is what he was saying, checking out our Bible study. And the new kids kind of had this dominant influence in the group. The group that he was already teaching was just a good, solid group of kids, really good kids. And this dominant influence comes in. And then a couple of those kids, because they started to come back, but a couple of those kids started mocking the other good kids. They were kind of making fun and joking and thinking it was all good, but it really wasn't. They began to set a tone for the entire Bible study, where their influence would cause the rest of the youth to be distracted. And were no longer worshiping, and they were no longer learning. And as soon as the pastor saw, if he didn't do something, do the right thing, this could have a lasting effect on these kids and God's work in the ministry. So he had to confront these kids, but ultimately was forced to cut them from out of the group for the furtherance of the work of the Lord. It had to be done. Just like here, Ishmael is scoffing at Isaac and Sarah at this feast thrown for Isaac. This was folks within their own household. So Sarah sees this and knew she needed to respond. Verse 10, therefore she said to Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son. She wouldn't even call them by their names. For the son of this bondwoman shall not be the heir with my son, namely with Isaac. In other words, they shall not be one and the same together within your household. The work of the flesh will not be mocking the son of the Lord's promise. The flesh needed to be cut off. Verse 11, and the matter was very displeasing to Abraham, or in Abraham's sight, because of his son. Now, Sarah has no attachment with Ishmael by blood. And I'm sure this wasn't what Abraham wanted to hear, but he couldn't dismiss it either. This situation was very displeasing to Abraham. It was hard for him because Ishmael was his son. You know, the Apostle Paul explains in Galatians chapter 4 concerning the two sons in the situation that with Abraham. It says, Paul speaks of the two sons, how Ishmael was the works of the flesh when Abraham tried to please God through his works to fulfill God's promise. You know, they tried to help God out, which Paul says Ishmael is symbolic for the works of the flesh. Okay? Where Isaac is the work of God's grace that was given through the supernatural work of the Holy Spirit, fulfilling God's promise, which Isaac is symbolic for the work of God's promise through grace, which Isaac, when you look at this, you see you have these two kids. I mean, they're symbols, and they're all in the same household. And where you have the flesh, you have the law, okay? And with the promise, you have God's grace, okay? So you have these two different things, and the law and grace, they cannot coexist. They cannot coexist, okay? Paul deals with the same issue with the early church, using the symbols of Abraham's sons, knowing law and grace cannot coexist, just as the flesh and the spirit cannot coexist. And this traces all the way back through history of the old, from the Old Testament. We're dealing with Cain and Abel, that they couldn't coexist either. There's always this son of the flesh and the spirit. So we see that Sarah's request in the midst of this troubles Abraham because this is his boy, and he loves Ishmael, and he is troubled because he knows what needs to happen. He understands it. He understands where she's coming from. But God said to Abraham in verse 12, do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice. For in Isaac your seed shall be called. Not Ishmael. It'll be through Isaac that the promise of the Messiah would be fulfilled. It would be through the Jews, not through the Arabs. Now, when you look back, we see Sarah had talked Abraham into laying with Hagar, and she was wrong for doing that, And Abraham was, wrong for listening too. But in this matter, she is right as she talks to him. And Abraham needs to heed her voice here, as the Lord said. But look how he responded in this whole situation. This is a heavy situation. Rather than continuing talking, or maybe even rejecting her thoughts, or maybe even trying to reason with Sarah, Abraham heard her in this, and then immediately sought God in the matter. Abraham would seek discernment from the Lord. He would not make any rash decisions based on what he wanted. He sought the will of the Lord. He wanted what the Lord wanted in this. So often we want to sit in the seat of fixing things. Maybe let things die down in the midst of, she's probably just angry, she'll blow off and all that. However, he knew this was a long-term matter. This was not going to go away. So Abraham sought the Lord in it, and God reiterated that his promise will be through Isaac. And so God is telling Abraham, do not let it be displeasing because of Ishmael and Hagar. I chose Isaac, and my choice must be protected even though it's difficult for you. God's plan is sovereign. Sometimes we have different plans, and sometimes we have different roads we want to try to go down. But if you look, he is protecting his plan through Isaac. It's not like it's a secret to Abraham because the promise was made 25 years ago. It was the lack of patience. It was the lack of waiting on the Lord. They forced the whole situation to happen, and now they're dealing with this right now. But God assures Abraham that Ishmael will be taken care of. God tells him in verse 13, yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he's your seed. So the Lord lets him know, hey, he'll be fine. You have Isaac. It may be hard for you to believe it, but the Jews and the Arabs are blood related through Abraham. They are both descendants of Abraham. Verse 14, so Abraham rose early in the morning, took bread and a skin of water, Putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, which is towards Egypt, but out in the dry desert. And the water in the skin was used up, and she placed the boy under one of the shrubs. Then she went out and sat down across from him at a distance of about a bow shot. You guys know how far a bow shot is? Neither do I, but when I remember in elementary school, we had the opportunity to shoot a bow and arrow, and we had these targets set up. Wasn't really thought out, in my opinion, well with how they had the targets right, up about 10 so feet or, down there, but behind it was the fence of the school, and then there was an alley, and then there were houses. So I don't know if you've ever shot one before, but I learned that even if you slightly have a different angle on the arrow and you let go of that bowstring, that arrow is going to fly in that direction. Because I remember having the arrow slightly, I'm thinking I'm going straight, but the arrow was like this, and I'm sitting there trying to, but by the time I thought I had it set and moved up and I let go, and that arrow went boom, over the target, over the fence, over the alley, and it landed on these people's roof. I think that was the most tense moment for my youth at that moment. I'm so glad that it came down on the house of the roof, or the roof of the house, than it to land in someone's backyard. That was so scary. Could have hurt somebody. So that went about 35, 40 yards. Could be a bow shot. I don't know. But bows in this time, they can shoot at a pretty good distance. That was their way of defense. So she's out in the desert. She's probably carrying Ishmael by this time because they were in the heat. They had ran out of water, and apparently Ishmael has no strength. So she laid the boy under a shrub. Looks like he might be getting to that point where he's so dehydrated he could be dying. She puts him at a distance from herself, yet she hasn't remembered in the midst of all this the promise that God gave her at the well in chapter 16, where he would make him a great nation. He told her that himself. But instead she lays him under a shrub, distances herself from the boy, for she said to herself, "Let me not see the death of the boy." So she sat opposite him and lifted her voice and wept. Verse 17, and God heard the voice of the lad. Isn't that interesting? Not the mother. You have her lifting her voice and weeping, but God heard the voice of the lad. Then the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, "What ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is." So the angel's asking, what's the matter, Hagar? What's the matter? Don't be afraid. God heard the voice of Ishmael and has a promise for him. It's like, come on, he's alive. God saw the lad where he's at, so he tells her, "Arise, lift up the lad and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation." So the Lord confirms his promise to Hagar again. It's like she needed to hear it again, right? And we see God's promise fulfilled today. There's Arabs. It fulfilled. Verse 19, then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. So God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. So he survived and prospered in the wilderness and became an archer, or in other words, a hunter. And he's now able to make a living by hunting food, and providing for himself. Verse 21, he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt, which was her homeland. Verse 22, and it came to pass at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, I believe, the commander of his army, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. Now, it sounds kind of funny how it says God is with you in all that you do, but basically, in a sense, he's saying God is blessing you in your life. It's like I'm seeing the blessings that is in your life. Now, back in this day, these pagan kings, they didn't believe in one God. They didn't believe in one God. They believed in like territorial gods or deities. Different gods would influence areas, either like in the valleys, or there'd be a different god that would influence an area on the mountaintops. And if you are blessed, it meant the God found favor with you. But if you're cursed with bad luck and all that, you might want to leave that area. But they noticed with Abraham, no matter where he was, his God traveled with him. His God was with him. And his God blessed him wherever he would go. And that was unlikely of any of the other gods that they've ever seen before. So this Abimelech, which might be from the previous chapter, which I believe it is. I believe it's that Abimelech, but I'll explain. Abimelech is not a name. Abimelech is a title. He's a ruler. It's such as like the Pharaoh. Abimelech was a ruler. So Abimelech comes and sees that he's very blessed, taken care of, and comes to Abraham to make a covenant with him. He brought this fiacole with him as sort of like a legal witness, or like that notary, that person that can sign off and say, I witnessed this. This is legit for this covenant. And so Abimelech goes to Abraham and says, now, therefore, swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me, with my offspring, or with my posterity, but that according to the kindness that I have done to you, you will do to me and to the land in which you have dwelt. Now think about what this Abimelech just did. All right. I would say that, as a ruler, this was a very wise thing for him to do. To Abraham, to make Abraham more of like an ally. You're seeing this guy blessed. He's living close to your land with him and we're not talking about like, a small amount of people. If you remember when he was attacking the four kings, it was him and 300 men. So it's like he didn't have this small little, family. And so this was a big, like, concubine, I guess, a big old traveling amounts of people. They had servants and all that. So he wanted to make Abraham an ally. Now think about it. Abimelech is more powerful than Abraham. Prosperous. He's just this powerful guy. Yet he recognizes his God and sees that by making a covenant with him, this would make a great future for them both and their descendants. And so knowing that the time was good, like, hey, this is the perfect timing, Abimelech makes his contract with him. And Abraham said, I will swear. Then Abraham immediately, check how smart this is, immediately Abraham rebukes Abimelech because of a well of water which Abimelech's servants had seized. And that's strange. So he makes this covenant with him and he goes, I swear, we're good. But, he brings up this whole thing about a well. So Abraham and his servants obviously dug a well, which is very valuable in the desert. And Abimelech's servants overpowered Abraham and seized the well from him. And so Abraham remembers this right off the bat and rebukes Abimelech for it. Kind of tested him. And Abimelech said, I don't know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, nor had I heard of it until today. So just as Abimelech was smart to make a covenant with Abraham, Abraham is just as smart to test Abimelech's sincerity right off the bat. And this was a good thing for Abraham to do, to test him. He was saying, if you really want to make things good with me, the well was stolen from me. Just restore it back to me. And we'll be good by his actions. He needed to make it right. He stole from him. He needed to make it right, which is fair. So Abimelech says, I didn't know about this until now. And he gave him his well. He was just like, I'm good with that. How do I know this? Well, they made that part of the covenant. It was part of it. Verse 27, so Abraham took sheep. This is his way of saying, okay, here's my receipt. You're going to tell me that this is my well. So he took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. And then on top of that, here's where the well thing. It says, and Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Then Abimelech asked him, what is the meaning of these 7 ewes, lambs, which you have set by themselves? And he says, you will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, that they may be my witness that I have dug this well. Therefore, he called that place Beersheba, because the two of them swore an oath there. So Abraham gave these 7 ewe lambs as Abimelech acknowledging the truth, that Abraham dug the well, and it was his. By him receiving these ewes as part of the deal, they were like the witness of this whole covenant. So if you think about it, it's just like, hey, you're taking these, you're acknowledging by these 7 ewes that I dug that well and it's mine. And by him receiving them, I receive it, I acknowledge it, we're good. So that's kind of how that worked. So they call that place Beersheba, meaning the well of the oath. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. So Abimelech rose with Phicol, the commander of his army, and they returned to the land of Philistines. Then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. So he marked the spot with this tamarisk tree, and I had to look it up. I'm like, what kind of a tree is that? You know? And it kind of looks like a shrub at first, but then it just kind of blooms into this big tree. And it was used for medicinal purposes. It was for the liver, the kidneys, and for fever. So they were able to use it for that period. So he plants this and calls on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days. Now, I was going into chapter 22, but there's so much in that and alone that we're not going through that this evening. And we'll continue that next week.